You ever notice how a classroom feels different when it's empty? I'm not talking about the silence of lunchtime, or the muffled echoes after the bell rings and everyone's already on their way home. No, I mean really empty. Late at night when the janitor's gone, the windows are black squares swallowing whatever weak moonlight creeps in, and the rows of desks look more like gravestones than furniture. It's a strange kind of quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you think maybe the room is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And if you listen long enough that your ears start to ache with the stillness, you begin to wonder if maybe you're not as alone as you thought. That's the thing about schools. They're supposed to be safe. They're supposed to be the places we send our kids, the places where we once sat, chewing on pencil erasers, doodling in margins, wishing the clock would move faster, but in the right light or maybe the wrong when they stop being safe. They stop being places of learning and start becoming places where the shadows in the corners know your name. I've heard a lot of stories, real stories, some whispered, some buried in police reports, and some that never made it beyond the trembling lips of the people who lived through them. But the one I'm going to tell you first has always unsettled me more than most, because it starts with something so ordinary, a substitute teacher. Now, if you're like me, you probably remember substitute teachers as temporary interruptions. Sometimes they were pushovers, letting the class run wild while they scribbled half-heartedly on the board. Sometimes they were strict, eager to prove they weren't to be messed with. But either way, they were placeholders. A day, maybe a week, and then they'd vanish, swallowed back into whatever pool of forgotten faces they came from. But what if one of them never left? What if one of them wasn't who they said they were? I still remember the way the girl told me this story. Her name was Heather, and her voice trembled like a violin string stretched too tight. She was 28 when I met her, but the story she told me dragged her back into the body of her 15-year-old self. And I swear, when she got to certain parts, it was like she wasn't even in the room with me anymore. She was back there, trapped behind those desks, staring into the smiling eyes of a stranger. It happened in 2004 at a small public high school in Pennsylvania. A forgettable kind of place. Red brick, buzzing fluorescent lights, hallways that smelled of waxed linoleum and sweat. A place like 1,000 others. But horror doesn't need castles or graveyards. Sometimes it just needs a substitute teacher in the wrong classroom. Heather said it started on a Monday morning. Their regular English teacher, Mrs. Barlow, was out sick flu, they thought. So when they walked into third period, there was someone new waiting for them. A man, mid-30s, maybe 40s, crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up, wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light, and a smile that stretched just a little too wide, like he was waiting for something nobody else understood. He wrote his name on the board in looping chalk letters. Mr. North. Heather remembered the way the chalk squealed across the surface, a high-pitched screech that made everyone wince. He apologized, chuckled in a low, warm tone, but didn't bother to fix the jagged handwriting. He just turned back to the class and started talking. At first, nobody thought much of him. He wasn't particularly strict, but he wasn't a pushover either. He had a way of looking at you when you spoke, really looking like you were the only person in the world who mattered. Some of the kids liked that, some didn't. Heather, she hated it, because his eyes lingered. Not in the usual way creepy teachers sometimes did. No, this was different. His eyes didn't wander across your body. They tunneled into you. They felt like drills, peeling back layers, digging for something private. Something you didn't even know you had inside you. By the second day, kids were already whispering. He didn't take attendance the way other teachers did. Instead of reading the roll, he went down each row, pointing to each student, saying their names before they could answer. First and last, perfect pronunciation, even for kids whose names were always butchered by substitutes. And when someone finally asked how he knew them all, he just smiled and said, "I make it a point to know my students." Heather swore she saw a shiver go through the class at that moment, like a draft of cold air had swept through the room. But no windows were open. Here's the thing, nobody knew who hired him. Normally, substitutes came through a district pool. They wore laminated badges, carried paperwork, but Heather said Mr. North never showed a badge. He never carried a briefcase or a lesson plan or even a lunch. He just appeared. Every morning, already standing by the desk when the first bell rang, like he'd been waiting in the dark. By the third day, kids were nervous. By the fourth, they were scared. Because Mr. North started asking questions, strange ones. Where do you go after school, Heather? Does your mother work late, Eric? Who walks you home, Lindsay? Always casual, always in that warm, velvety voice that made it hard to tell him no. But the questions burrowed under their skin. They didn't feel like teacherly concern, they felt like reconnaissance. Heather said the real breaking point came on Friday. She was packing up her books when she realized Mr. North wasn't at the desk anymore. He was standing at the back of the room, by the windows, staring out into the courtyard. His head tilted, his lips moving like he was whispering to someone, but there was no one there. She thought maybe he was talking to himself, until he turned around and his eyes looked wet, like something was moving behind them. That's where I'll stop for now. Because what happened next, what happened in the second week, is the kind of thing that changes a person forever. Heather told me that by the time Mr. North was gone, 3 students had dropped out of school, 1 had disappeared, and she herself had scars on her arms she still couldn't explain. For now, I want you to sit with this. A classroom is a fragile place. It only takes one unfamiliar face to tilt it into something unrecognizable. And sometimes, when a substitute teacher walks into your life, they're not there to teach you anything at all. There's a truth about horror nobody tells you. It doesn't come in crashing all at once. No, it seeps. Like water under a locked door, like a whisper in a crowded room. The worst kind of terror doesn't make you scream, it makes you doubt. It makes you second-guess the corners of your vision, the little inconsistencies in your own memory. That's how it was with Mr. North. Heather said the first week was uncomfortable, sure, but manageable. Students whispered, they traded uneasy glances, but they laughed it off when the final bell rang. Kids are good at that, masking unease with jokes, pretending the wolf in the woods is just a dog. But by the second week, the laughter stopped. Because Mr. North wasn't just watching anymore. He was changing things. It began on Monday. Heather walked into the classroom, bleary-eyed from staying up too late on the phone with a friend. At first, nothing seemed off. Same desks. Same dusty blinds filtering the morning light into thin, brittle stripes. But when she slid into her seat, she realized the posters on the back wall weren't the same. Last Friday, they'd been motivational slogans, read more. Success is a journey, that sort of thing. Now, they were blank. Just white paper tacked up with thumbtacks, as if someone had stripped the color away in the night. When she pointed it out to her friend Lindsay, Lindsay frowned and said, "They've always been like that." But Heather knew. She remembered the peeling corner of the reading poster, the smudge of gum stuck beneath the success sign. And now it was all gone, erased. Mr. North noticed her staring. He smiled. "Sometimes things are only as real as we believe them to be," he said. No one had asked him. On Tuesday, he brought no books, no lesson plans. He didn't even write on the chalkboard. Instead, he asked the students to close their eyes. Heather resisted at first, but when she looked around, nearly the whole class had already complied, even the ones who usually mock teachers behind their backs. Their heads bowed, lids shut, like they'd been lulled into sleepwalking. "Picture your home," Mr. North said in that velvet voice. "Picture it in perfect detail. The walls, the furniture, the sound of your parents moving in other rooms. Now, picture it empty." Heather said her heart jumped at that. No furniture, no family, just silence. She wanted to open her eyes, but something heavy pressed against her lids, not his hands. Nothing physical, just a weight, a command. "Now," Mr. North whispered, "imagine someone else living there, walking your halls. Sleeping in your bed, wearing your skin." Heather's eyes snapped open. She couldn't help it. And she swore she saw him looking straight at her, even though his own eyes were closed. By Wednesday, kids were acting different, quiet, withdrawn. Some of them stopped eating at lunch, just staring at their trays as if the food had lost all taste. Others refused to talk between classes, like they were saving their voices for him. And then there was Eric. Eric was the loud one. The kind of kid who shoved people in hallways, who bragged about his weekend conquests, who laughed too loud at his own jokes. He wasn't afraid of anyone. Until Mr. North, that day when Mr. North called on him to read a passage from Macbeth, Eric froze. He stared at the book like it was written in a language he didn't understand. Mr. North stepped closer. "Go on, Eric," he said softly. "The words are already inside you." Eric's lips began to move. But what came out wasn't Shakespeare. It wasn't even English. Heather described it as guttural, animalistic. A sound that made her stomach turn like someone trying to vomit while speaking in reverse. The rest of the class sat still, their faces slack, eyes glazed, as if none of them heard how wrong it was. When Eric finally collapsed back in his seat, sweating and pale, Mr. North clapped his hands together. "Beautifully done, and the worst part?" Nobody questioned it. Nobody but Heather. Thursday night, Heather couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, standing in the corner of her bedroom, smiling that too wide smile, whispering things she couldn't hear but somehow felt in her bones. When she finally drifted into uneasy dreams, she woke to find her bedroom window open. The latch had been broken. Cold air flooded in, smelling faintly of chalk dust. Her mother swore she hadn't touched it. Friday was the day things snapped. Heather came to class to find Eric's desk empty, not just empty, gone, as if it had never existed. When she whispered to Lindsay about it, Lindsay looked confused. "Eric who?" And that's when Heather realized the posters were the only things that had been erased. By the end of the second week, Mr. North had them, all but Heather. Because she kept seeing the little cracks, the erasures. The way reality bent itself around him like heat waves on asphalt. And that's when he began focusing on her. Friday afternoon, he dismissed the class early. Everyone but her. Heather froze in her seat as the others filed out, glassy-eyed, murmuring their goodbyes like automatons. When the door finally shut, Mr. North leaned against the desk and looked at her. "You don't belong with them," he said gently. "You see too much." Heather tried to speak, but her throat was dry. He tilted his head. "That's good. I like the ones who see. The others are just vessels. But you? You're awake." And then he walked toward her, slow, deliberate steps echoing in the empty room. His eyes shimmered, not with light, but with movement, like something crawling just beneath the surface. Heather clutched her backpack, ready to bolt. But before she could move, he leaned down, so close she could smell his breath. "Tell me," he whispered, "when you dream. Do you dream in your own skin or someone else's?" That's where Heather broke. She ran. She didn't even remember grabbing her bag. 1 second she was pinned beneath his gaze. The next she was flying down the hallway, sneakers slapping against tile, the sound of his laughter echoing behind her. She didn't stop until she was outside, lungs burning, staring up at the pale afternoon sky. But when she turned back, the classroom windows were dark, and Mr. North was gone. That was just the second week, and the horror was only beginning. Because the following Monday, 3 students wouldn't show up, and only one of them would ever come back. The following Monday should have been ordinary. It should have been just another gray morning filled with yawns, scribbled homework, and the smell of burnt coffee drifting from the teacher's lounge. But Heather swore the air itself was different when she stepped into the building that day, heavier, thicker, like walking through smoke you couldn't see. And when she reached the classroom, the first thing she noticed wasn't the missing desks, it was the silence. Teenagers are never silent. There's always chatter, laughter, paper balls being thrown, groans about pop quizzes. But that morning, the kids sat in eerie stillness, hands folded neatly on their desks, eyes fixed on the chalkboard as if waiting for something. 3 desks were gone. Eric's was one of them. 2 others had vanished as well, Janine and Mark. Heather's heart skipped when she whispered their names. Nobody reacted, nobody even blinked. It was as if they'd never existed. Mr. North strolled in a moment later, whistling a tune that didn't sound quite human. Not off-key, not exactly, it just had too many notes. Like he was weaving a melody meant for ears that weren't human. "Good morning, class," he said cheerfully, placing nothing on the desk because, of course, he never brought anything. "I trust you all rested well." "Except you, Heather." Her stomach dropped. Because he was right, she hadn't slept. Nightmares had clawed at her, dreams of blank white classrooms and rows of faces with their eyes scratched out. And when she'd woken, her sheets were damp, not with sweat, but with something sticky, dark, and copper-scented. She'd checked her arms, her legs, but found no cuts. No source, just the stain. How could he know? The lesson that day wasn't Shakespeare or grammar. It wasn't anything you'd find in a textbook. He stood at the front of the room, rolling up his sleeves slowly, methodically, like a butcher preparing for work. "Today," he said, "we're going to learn about what comes after silence." No one asked what he meant. He told them to take out their notebooks. Every hand obeyed, every hand but hers. "Write," he commanded. Heather glanced at her classmates, horrified as they began scrawling across the paper, fast. Too fast. Pens scratching like claws on bone, filling page after page with words they didn't seem to understand. Their lips moved soundlessly, whispering syllables that slipped through the cracks of her hearing. She leaned over, trying to catch a glimpse of Lindsay's notebook. The words weren't English, not any language she knew. They curled across the page in sharp, spidery lines, blackening the sheets like a spreading infection. The ink shimmered faintly, like oil on water. When Lindsay noticed Heather looking, she smiled dreamily. "Isn't it beautiful?" Heather's skin crawled. After class, Heather tried to talk to one of the other teachers. A math teacher named Mr. Wilkins. He was a round man with a kind face, the sort who kept candy in his desk drawer for kids who forgot lunch. She told him about the missing students, about the notebooks, about Mr. North. At first, he listened patiently, but then his smile froze like a mask cracking at the edges. Finally, he said softly, "We don't talk about substitutes here," and then he shut the door in her face. That night, Heather dreamed again. This time she was back in the classroom, but the desks stretched endlessly in every direction, vanishing into shadow. And every seat was filled with students who had no mouths. Just blank, pale skin where their lips should have been. At the front stood Mr. North, but he wasn't smiling anymore. He leaned close to her, whispering in that same velvet tone. "Don't worry, I'll give you a new mouth." She woke screaming. By Wednesday, she couldn't take it anymore. She tried to skip class, hiding in the bathroom stall until the period was over. But when the bell rang and she stepped out, her heart nearly stopped. Because Mr. North was waiting by the sinks. No books, no papers. Just standing there, as if he'd known where she would be. "You shouldn't be late," he said. His voice was calm, but his eyes glittered like broken glass. "It sets a bad example." She bolted past him, her shoes squeaking on the tiles, and didn't look back until she was safe in the cafeteria. But even then, she couldn't shake the feeling he was watching her. Thursday was worse. When she entered the classroom, her desk was gone. Not just empty, gone. In its place was a smooth patch of tile, as though it had never existed. "Looks like you don't belong here anymore," Mr. North said softly, almost kindly. "But don't worry. I have a seat for you," he pointed to the corner. A single chair sat there, facing away from the rest of the class, its legs screeching across the floor when she reluctantly pulled it back. All through the lesson, she felt his eyes on her. The others scribbled obediently in their notebooks, lost in their trance, but he watched her, always her. And when she finally dared to glance back at him, she realized he hadn't blinked once. Friday was the breaking point. Heather came into the room trembling, every instinct screaming at her to run. But she forced herself to sit in the corner, too afraid of what would happen if she didn't. Halfway through class, a sound broke the silence. A whimper. It came from the back row. One of the students, Lindsay, was shaking, her hands trembling as she tried to keep writing. The ink spilled across the desk, dripping onto the floor in thick black rivulets. "Enough," Mr. North said. But Lindsay kept trembling. Tears welled in her eyes. "I said enough." The lights flickered. And then Heather swore she saw Lindsay's pen split her skin. Her hand jerked violently, carving letters directly into her palm. The ink wasn't ink anymore. It was blood. The class didn't move, didn't react. "They just kept writing," Heather screamed. Mr. North smiled. That was the moment she realized. He wasn't just a teacher. He was teaching them something, and the lesson wasn't meant for their minds. It was meant for their flesh. There's a point in every nightmare where you realize you're not going to wake up. You tell yourself you will, you pinch your arm, you bite your lip, you scream into the dark, but nothing changes. The dream just keeps going, dragging you deeper. That Friday, Heather realized she wasn't living through a bad week at school. She was trapped in someone else's nightmare. And Mr. North was the dreamer. Lindsay never came back after that day. The seat she'd bled into was gone by Monday. Vanished, tiles spotless as though nothing had ever touched it. Heather asked about her in hushed tones, but every time she said the name, people just stared at her blankly. Lindsay who? That was the pattern. The disappearances weren't just physical, they were erasures. First Eric, then Janine, then Mark. Now Lindsay? The world folded neatly around the gaps, like paper creased to hide the missing corner. And Heather knew she was next. By Tuesday, she stopped pretending. She didn't try to act normal, didn't join the murmuring, glassy-eyed drones scribbling their alien script. She just sat in her corner seat, fists clenched, pulse hammering, waiting for the inevitable. And Mr. North noticed. He always noticed. "Why do you resist, Heather?" he asked that morning, pacing slowly between the rows. "The others have learned their lessons? They've opened themselves? You cling to the lie of the world outside." He stopped in front of her desk. Leaning down, he whispered, "You still believe your mother will be home tonight, that your friends remember you. But tell me, what if they don't?" She glared at him, heart pounding. "You're lying." His smile widened. "Am I?" And then he snapped his fingers. The classroom windows went black, not dark like storm clouds, not shaded like blinds, black like slabs of obsidian pressed against the glass. The overhead lights flickered, sputtered, and then dimmed until only a faint, sickly glow remained. Heather looked around and realized the students weren't students anymore. Their faces had smoothed, their eyes sunken into pits of shadow, their mouths hanging open like dolls left too long in the attic. The pens in their hands scratched furiously, but the paper wasn't paper, it was skin. Thin, translucent, pulsing. Each stroke etched glowing red lines that writhed like worms. Heather gagged. "What are you doing to them?" She choked. Mr. North straightened, eyes glittering. "Teaching," he said simply. She tried to run. Bolted for the door, slammed her hand against the handle only to find it wouldn't move. The metal was soft, pliant like clay. When she pulled her hand back, strands of it clung to her skin, warm and sticky. Behind her, Mr. North chuckled. "There's nowhere to go, Heather. There's never been anywhere to go. Did you really think this school had walls? Doors? You've been in my classroom from the start." Her breath hitched. She turned, backing against the sealed door, shaking her head. "You're not real," he stepped forward. "Oh, I'm real enough. More real than the life you cling to. The life where your father left, where your mother drowns herself in wine, where you lie awake, wondering if anyone would notice if you disappeared." Her knees buckled. How did he know? He crouched in front of her, tilting his head, glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose. Behind the lenses, his eyes writhed with movement, tiny shapes swimming just beneath the surface, pressing outward like trapped insects. "I notice," he whispered. That was when Heather snapped, not into fear, into fury. She grabbed her chair, swung it with all her strength. It shattered against his shoulder, splintering into shards of wood. For the first time, his smile faltered. And that was when she saw it. The wound wasn't blood. It wasn't flesh, it was empty, like the chair had broken against a hollow space. He staggered back, expression twisting, voice dropping into a guttural snarl. "Ungrateful little vessel!" The lights exploded. Darkness swallowed the room. Heather stumbled, heart pounding, surrounded by the frantic scratching of pens. Then silence. Her ears rang in the void. And then she felt it, a hand, cold and damp, clutching her wrist. She screamed, jerking free, running blindly. Desks toppled, chairs scraped, invisible fingers clawed at her clothes. Her lungs burned as she slammed against something hard, something that gave way with a groan. She tumbled forward and found herself sprawled in the hallway. The classroom door slammed behind her. And when she scrambled to her feet and looked, the door was gone. Just smooth, unbroken wall. She staggered home in a daze, half expecting the streets to be gone too. But they were there. The houses, the cars, the neighbors mowing their lawns. Normal, too normal. When she tried to tell her mother, the woman frowned. "What teacher?" "Honey, you don't even take English this semester." Heather ran to her room, hands shaking, pulling her notebooks from her bag. Every page was blank, except the last one. One sentence scrawled in black ink, neat and looping. "Class dismissed." Heather never saw Mr. North again. But sometimes, when she closes her eyes at night, she swears she hears chalk scratching on a board, and in her dreams the desks are always waiting. That was the first story. The first classroom. And if you think that's the worst the halls of education have to offer, wait until you hear about the door you're not supposed to open. The door that leads to the room that isn't supposed to exist. That's where we're going next. I'd love to tell you the story of Mr. Ashford ending neatly, like a paper folded clean down the middle. I'd love to say the school board received anonymous complaints, that administrators checked on the man, realized he was unfit, and quietly dismissed him before the whispers turned to screams. But the truth never comes packaged that way. Not in schools, not in horror, and certainly not in the life of a teacher who should never have been allowed near children. See, what happened in the weeks following the field trip wasn't just strange. It wasn't merely unusual. It was a descent. A slow, ugly spiral that no one could stop once the momentum started. When classes resumed on Monday, something felt off. The students shuffled into room 2B the way they always did, slamming lockers, laughing, and tossing paper footballs into the air. But the moment they crossed the threshold into Mr. Ashford's domain, their voices faltered. It was subtle, but I swear the air inside that room had shifted. He had drawn the blinds shut and turned off half the fluorescent lights. The place smelled faintly of mildew and chalk, even though the janitor swore he cleaned it every night. The students noticed too. "Why is it so dark in here?" A girl whispered to her friend. "Where's the sun?" Another muttered. Mr. Ashford didn't answer. He simply stood by his desk, hands folded, lips curling into a half smile that made the kids uneasy. That day he didn't teach. He told stories, not math problems. Not history lessons, stories. They weren't fairy tales or myths either. They were fragments, descriptions of old buildings abandoned after tragedies. Children who wandered into the woods and returned with their eyes wrong. Families who disappeared from their homes with plates still warm on the dinner table. The kids laughed nervously at first, but their giggles never lasted. Because he told these stories with a detail too, precise, like he'd seen the peeling wallpaper himself, smelled the spoiled food still on the stove, heard the echoes of the missing children's last cries. By the end of the week, even the toughest kids, the ones who usually rolled their eyes and played on their phones, sat wide-eyed, trapped between disbelief and fear. On Friday, Mr. Ashford introduced a new assignment. He handed out plain black notebooks, no title, no lines on the cover. Just matte black covers, the kind that seemed to swallow the light. "Write in these," he said softly. "Every day, anything you dream. Anything you remember from your childhood. Write it down. Don't worry about spelling or grammar. Just let the thoughts come." A boy raised his hand. "Is this like for English class?" "No," Ashford said. His voice was so calm it silenced the room. "This is for you. These journals are important. Don't lose them. Don't let anyone else read them. Especially your parents." The children stared. Some exchanged nervous glances, but Ashford's smile never faltered. And when a teacher tells you to do something with that kind of quiet insistence, you don't argue. You just obey. That night, 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds sat in their rooms and scribbled into those black notebooks. Some wrote about nightmares. Others wrote about memories they weren't sure were real, and a few swore they wrote things they had never known before. Names of towns they'd never visited, old lullabies their parents had never sung. Sketches of symbols that seemed to form under their hands without thought. By Monday morning, a strange silence hovered over room 2B. The students shuffled in, clutching their notebooks like something precious. None of them laughed now. None of them even whispered. Ashford looked at them all, and his grin widened. You'd think the administration would have noticed by now. But here's the thing. Schools don't watch closely unless they forced to. Principals are busy. Secretaries are tired. Other teachers are drowning in their own work. And so the man's odd behavior passed unchecked. But the children saw the changes. They always do. His clothes grew darker, heavier. The tan jackets and striped ties disappeared. He came in wearing black wool coats even on warm days, buttoned to the throat. His hands trembled sometimes, and the veins on his arms seemed more prominent, like blue worms writhing under pale skin. One student swore his eyes were changing color, not fully, but just a flicker from green to gray, from gray to a pale, foggy white. Another claimed they saw scratches on his neck, thin red lines like he'd clawed at himself in the night. And then there was his smell. The kids whispered about it when he wasn't near. "He smells like wet dirt," one boy muttered. "No, it's like old books," another said. "No," a girl insisted. "It's like a dead animal, like when you find one under your porch." None of them were entirely wrong. The janitor was the first adult to truly notice something wrong. Mr. Howard had worked there 20 years, a good man. He kept to himself, whistled as he pushed his mop, and sometimes handed out extra pencils to kids who forgot theirs. One night, long after sunset, he heard something in room 2B. At first he thought it was just the hum of the radiator, but then came the scratching, long, steady, deliberate, like a nail dragging across a blackboard. He opened the door, and there was Mr. Ashford, alone in the dark classroom, standing in front of the blackboard. But he wasn't writing with chalk. He was dragging his fingernails down the slate over and over, leaving pale lines that bled white dust. His lips were moving. He was whispering something. Over and over, Howard froze in the doorway. Mr. Ashford?" Ashford turned. His eyes caught the faint light, and for a moment, just a moment, they gleamed like two whetstones. Howard said later he felt a coldness, a heavy silence that pressed on his chest. And then, just as quickly, Ashford smiled. "Working late?" he asked in that soft voice. The janitor nodded, muttered something about the trash, and left. He didn't go back in that room for the rest of the year. By October, the children weren't the same. Their parents noticed first. One mother said her daughter wouldn't eat dinner anymore, just pushed peas around her plate and whispered to herself. Another said her son woke screaming every night at the same time. 2:11, A third swore her daughter's handwriting had changed overnight, looping in sharp letters written backward as if in a mirror. When parents asked about the notebooks, the kids clutched them tight and refused to show a single page. And still, Mr. Ashford smiled. It was inevitable someone would demand answers. The principal called for a meeting. Parents packed into the cafeteria, arms crossed, muttering, demanding explanations. Where was the curriculum? Why were their children having nightmares? Why had the teacher assigned secret journals? Mr. Ashford stood at the front of the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply looked at each parent with those pale, shifting eyes, and one by one, the complaints softened, voices faltered. Arguments dissolved into confused silence. By the end of the meeting, only a handful of parents still seemed angry. The rest left muttering that maybe they'd overreacted. Maybe Mr. Ashford was just different. It wasn't persuasion. It wasn't reason. It was something deeper, something that slithered into the mind and rewrote the script. Then came the whispering. Students began reporting that even when Ashford stood silent at the chalkboard, they heard him, not out loud. Not with their ears, but inside. "Right," the voice would murmur. "Draw. Remember," one boy claimed he heard the whispers even at home. Another swore the voice told him to go outside at night, stand barefoot in the yard, and stare at the sky until dawn. And when the children asked each other about it, they realized they were all hearing the same things. The tipping point came in November. A boy named Caleb didn't come to school. At first, everyone thought he was sick, but after 3 days, his mother called the school in tears. He was gone. His bed empty, his shoes still by the door, his black notebook missing. Police searched the woods, the river, the neighborhoods. Nothing, no trace. And yet, in room 2B, his desk remained. And Mr. Ashford never removed his name from the roll. Every morning he still called, "Caleb? Present?" And then, smiling faintly, "Yes, you are." The descent had reached its bottom. But the story of Mr. Ashford wasn't finished yet, because horror rarely ends when you think it will. It festers, it grows, and like mold in the dark corners of a school, it waits to spread. There's a particular kind of silence that comes over a school after a tragedy. It isn't the polite hush you hear at assemblies or during morning announcements. No, it's heavier. It's the kind of silence that crawls into the air vents and hallways, making even lockers slam softer, making laughter feel like a crime. That's the silence that settled over Westbrook Elementary after Caleb disappeared. You'd think it would have been chaos, parents storming the office, cops prowling the halls, teachers locking their doors. But the strangest part, after the initial panic, things seemed to smooth over too smoothly. The police report said runaway, 10 years old, a runaway. The school board accepted it. The local paper buried the story under high school football scores. And within a week, most parents acted like Caleb had never existed at all. But the students knew better. They whispered it in bathrooms and on the swing set. They saw the way Mr. Ashford kept Caleb's desk untouched, his chair neatly pushed in, his notebook gone. They heard the way he called his name during roll, pausing, waiting, smiling faintly before moving on. And when the kids dared to open their black notebooks at night, some swore they saw Caleb's handwriting among their own words in crooked lines, drawings in the margins. "Still here," one message read. "Don't forget me," said another. After Caleb vanished, the lessons grew stranger. No more math problems, no history dates. Instead, Ashford drew symbols on the blackboard, circles within circles, lines intersecting at odd angles. They didn't match any language, any alphabet, any geometry the students had seen. Yet somehow the kids understood, not all of them at first, but little by little comprehension spread like an infection. A girl would gasp in recognition when a shape appeared, scribbling it into her notebook with feverish intensity. A boy would mutter phrases under his breath, phrases in no known tongue, and Ashford watched, always with that pale, shifting gaze, like he was feeding off their growing unease. One afternoon, a student sitting near the back raised his hand. "Mr. Ashford, why are the windows black?" The teacher turned slowly. The class followed his gaze. And for the first time, they noticed the tall windows along the right wall weren't showing the playground outside. They weren't showing anything. Just black, oily, rippling black, like looking into a tar pit. The students sat frozen. The boy who asked began to cry softly, and Ashford. He smiled. "Focus on your work," he said gently. "The view is irrelevant." From that day on, no one sat near the windows. Finally, someone in authority stepped in. Principal Henderson, a weary man with thinning hair and a belly that stretched his shirts, decided to check in. He walked into room 2B one morning, clipboard in hand. The students barely looked up. By then, their notebooks had become shackles they couldn't escape. Henderson cleared his throat. "Mr. Ashford, I've been getting questions about your teaching methods." Ashford didn't look at him. He just kept writing his impossible symbols on the board. "Sir," Henderson pressed, "this isn't..." That's when it happened. The lights flickered, just once. But in that flicker, every student swore they saw Henderson's reflection in the blackboard, only it wasn't him. It was his face stretched long, eyes hollow, mouth opened wider than a human mouth could go. When the light steadied, Henderson stumbled back. His face had gone pale, his lips trembling. "Carry on," he muttered, and left without another word. The next morning he called in sick. Then, the morning after that, he resigned. The journals no longer felt like assignments. They were compulsions. Students wrote during class, during lunch in the halls. Some said their hands cramped, but they couldn't stop. Others claimed they weren't even guiding the pen anymore. It moved on its own. One boy tore a page from his book and showed it to a friend. It was a drawing of room 2B, every desk, every detail. Except in the picture, the children weren't sitting in chairs. They were standing in a circle around Ashford, their faces blank, their mouths open wide. The friend screamed and ripped the page up. But that night, when he opened his own notebook, the drawing was there again. Only this time, it was in his handwriting. In December, another child vanished. Her name was Rebecca. Sweet, shy girl with pigtails and freckles. She went to bed one night with her black notebook under her pillow. In the morning, her bed was empty. Her parents found the window unlocked, footprints in the snow outside, but the footprints didn't lead away. They led to the house. Rebecca's journal was never recovered, and once again, Mr. Ashford called her name during roll. Rebecca? Present. Smile. The children didn't laugh anymore. They didn't question. They just stared at him with hollow eyes, clutching their notebooks like lifelines. By midwinter, the whispers in the children's heads became commands. Wake, right, wait for the knock, and then so they did. One by one, students began sneaking outside at night, standing in their yards barefoot, staring up at the sky. Some parents dragged them back inside, shouting, shaking them. Others never even noticed. And those who stood too long claimed they saw things above them, not stars, not planes, but shapes. Crawling shapes, drifting across the night sky like living shadows. The notebooks recorded it all. Sketches of wings too large, bodies too thin, eyes that weren't eyes at all. Finally, one boy cracked. He showed his parents his notebook. Every page was filled, cover to cover, with drawings of a tall figure in a black coat. Sometimes in the classroom, sometimes at the foot of his bed, sometimes standing just outside his window at night. His parents stormed the school the next morning, demanding answers. They shoved the notebook at the superintendent. But when the man flipped through it, the pages were blank. Every single one. The boy swore he'd filled them all. Swore his parents had seen it too. But the superintendent just frowned and told them to calm down. The boy never came back to class. His family moved away before Christmas, and still, Ashford smiled. The last week of school before winter break, room 2B was nearly empty. A dozen desks sat vacant. The children who remained looked hollow, skin pale, lips chapped, eyes ringed with dark circles. On Friday, Ashford called roll. Caleb? Present. Rebecca? Present. Daniel? Sarah? Aaron? Each name followed by a pause. Each pause followed by the same whispered word, as though the missing children were answering from somewhere unseen. And then he looked at the class, those few trembling kids who hadn't yet disappeared. Soon, he said softly. You'll understand soon, and that was the breaking point. The parents couldn't deny it anymore. The school board couldn't look away. And whatever Mr. Ashford was, whatever thing had slipped into Westbrook Elementary, wearing the skin of a substitute teacher, it was about to be exposed. But exposure in horror doesn't always mean salvation. By the time December snow sealed the streets of Westbrook, room 2B was a place nobody wanted to talk about. Not the students, not the parents, not even the janitors. It was a blight, a festering sore in the heart of the school, and everyone knew it, though most pretended not to. But silence never stops rot. It only lets it grow. And that winter something had grown too large to ignore. The first mother to break was Caleb's. She stood outside the school one morning in the snow, wrapped in her husband's coat, shaking as she screamed at the building itself. Her voice cracked through the crisp air. "Where is my son? Where is he?" Teachers tried to calm her. Students watched wide-eyed from the buses. But when she collapsed, sobbing into the slush, the cracks spread. Parents began talking, comparing stories. Nightmares, journals, whispers in their children's rooms. Stories of kids waking up with dirt under their fingernails. Stories of children refusing to eat anything except the lunches Ashford provided in class. It all added up to something that could no longer be ignored. And so, in the week before Christmas break, the parents gathered in the cafeteria. Not for a polite meeting this time. Not for coffee and cookies. This time they came with fury in their eyes. That night, three fathers forced the door to room 2B. They expected to find lesson plans. Maybe evidence of neglect, maybe journals full of strange drawings. What they found was worse. The blackboard was covered edge to edge in symbols, every inch of slate scratched with circles and lines and spirals that seemed to move if you stared too long. The desks had been pushed to the sides of the room, leaving a wide open space in the middle, a circle of bare floor, and on that floor, a ring of children's notebooks, dozens of them, opened, their pages fluttering, though no wind blew. The fathers didn't linger. They slammed the door, locked it behind them, and swore they'd call the police. But when the cops came the next morning, room 2B looked perfectly normal. Desks in rows, blackboard wiped clean, notebooks gone. The parents' desperation grew when they noticed something new. The children's eyes, not all the time, not always obvious, but sometimes when they looked up from their notebooks, their pupils seemed wrong, too wide, too narrow. The irises washed pale like dirty glass. One mother swore her son's eyes reflected symbols when the light hit them, not shapes, not patterns, but the same cursed marks Ashford drew on the board. She dragged him to an optometrist. The doctor said his vision was perfect. The mother never came back to pick him up. The sheriff's visit, the breaking point, came when the sheriff himself was called in. Sheriff Dwyer was a tough man, wide-shouldered, with hands scarred from years of work before the badge. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses. He believed in drunks, in thieves, in the usual ugliness of small towns. But even he had heard whispers about Ashford. He marched into room 2B in the middle of class, hand resting on his holster. The children didn't stir. They sat, heads bent over their notebooks, pencils scratching in unison. Ashford looked up slowly. "Sheriff?" he said softly. "What a surprise." Dwyer demanded he step into the hall. Ashford smiled. "Of course." They left the classroom together. Minutes passed, 10, 15. The students never lifted their heads. The sound of pencils never stopped. When the door finally opened, only Ashford came back in, alone. The sheriff's cruiser remained parked outside all day. That night, it was gone. Sheriff Dwyer was never seen again. By January, the children had stopped whispering. They had started singing, not full songs, just fragments. Strange little tunes, hummed under their breath, dissonant, haunting. At night, parents reported hearing them through the walls. Whole neighborhoods filled with the faint sound of children's voices rising together in some alien melody. One father recorded it on a cassette. When he played it back, it wasn't singing at all. It was static, with a single clear voice layered beneath, whispering his own name. He burned the tape in his backyard and never spoke of it again. Finally, the parents had enough. On a storm-slashed night in February, nearly 24 of them stormed the school. They carried flashlights, crowbars, and the kind of desperate courage born from fear for your children. They broke into room 2B, and this time the room didn't hide. The desks were gone. The floor was bare stone, though no one could explain how the tiles had vanished. Symbols burned faintly in the walls, glowing like embers. And at the center of the room stood Ashford. Not writing, not teaching, waiting. The parents froze at the threshold. Their lights flickered. The air stank of mold and something sweet like rotting fruit. "Give them back," one mother sobbed. "Give us our children." Ashford tilted his head. His eyes gleamed pale, too pale. "They are with me," he whispered. "They are learning. Where are they?" He smiled. "In the dark. Where all children go eventually." That was when one father swung his crowbar. The blow landed against Ashford's shoulder, but the man didn't flinch. The crowbar clanged to the floor as though it had struck stone. Ashford's smile widened. His teeth looked wrong. Too many. Too sharp. The parents fled. The next morning, room 2B was locked. The principal claimed there had been a break-in, that vandals had trashed the room, that everything would be restored by spring. But the children knew the truth. They still clutched their notebooks, still hummed their songs, still stared out windows that no longer showed the playground. And when Ashford returned, not a hair out of place, not a wrinkle in his coat, the students didn't question. They bent their heads and wrote. The parents had tried to confront the horror, but horror doesn't yield to crowbars and flashlights. Horror waits, horror teaches. And in Westbrook Elementary, the lessons were far from over. There comes a moment in every story when the cracks widen so far, you can no longer pretend the house isn't falling apart. For Westbrook Elementary, that moment arrived in March. The air was heavy, wet with thawing snow. Mud clung to the boots of children who no longer played at recess, who no longer laughed in hallways, who no longer acted like children at all. They shuffled from class to class with their black notebooks clutched tight. Their skin looked pale, stretched thin, as if winter had hollowed them from the inside. And their eyes, God, their eyes gleamed with the reflection of symbols no adult could understand. But it was the voices that broke the last fragile thread of denial. It started in the library. Mrs. Cunningham, a librarian with bifocals and arthritis, swore she heard whispering from the vents. At first, she thought it was kids skipping class, hiding in the ductwork. But when she pressed her ear against the grate, the voices were too many, too layered. Hundreds of whispers, all chanting in a low, droning tone. And then she swore. The voices began to say her name. She staggered back, clutching her chest, heart hammering like a trapped bird. When she told the principal, he dismissed her. Old pipes. Drafts carry sound in funny ways, but the whispers spread. Teachers heard them in the staff lounge. Janitors in the supply closets. Even the cafeteria workers paused, trays in hand, when the vents hummed with soft, relentless voices. The school had become a mouth, and the walls were learning to speak. Parents started finding their children's notebooks hidden in strange places. One mother opened her oven and found her daughter's notebook sitting on the middle rack, pages warm to the touch. Another father discovered his son's notebook under his pillow, though he swore he'd locked it in the garage. A third family found theirs buried in the backyard, the soil still wet, though no one remembered digging. Each time, the parents tried to destroy the books, burning, shredding, throwing them in the river. But every morning, without fail, the notebooks returned to their children's hands. And every morning, the pages were fuller than before. One stormy afternoon, the power went out. The school plunged into darkness. Emergency lights flickered weakly, red and uncertain. Teachers tried to keep the kids calm, but in room 2B, calm wasn't an option. Because when the lights failed, the children didn't scream, they didn't panic, they stood up. Every last one, as though pulled by invisible strings. Their chairs clattered against the floor. Their notebooks opened on their desks, pages fluttering though no wind stirred. And together they began to hum. A low, resonant sound that vibrated the walls, rattled the windows, set the teacher's teeth on edge. When the power returned 20 minutes later, the children sat back down silently. They picked up their pencils. They resumed their writing. Not one spoke of what had happened. It was Mrs. Delaney, the art teacher, who finally saw him for what he was. She stayed late one night, grading projects. Passing by room 2B, she glanced inside. And there, standing at the blackboard, was Mr. Ashford, but he wasn't alone. The missing children stood around him, pale and silent, notebooks clutched in their skeletal hands. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Ashford's body was shifting, flickering in and out of shape. One moment, the man in a black coat. The next, something taller, something thinner, its face stretched into a mask of bone and shadow. Its hands too many fingers, too long, scraping symbols into the board without chalk. Delaney gasped. Ashford's head snapped toward her. His face still human, but his eyes, those weren't human anymore. They were endless, cavernous, a sky with no stars. Delaney ran. The next morning she resigned. She left town within a week. Spring came, snow melted. Grass pushed through the thawing soil, and one by one the children began to vanish completely. No broken windows, no forced doors. They simply weren't in their beds come morning. Their notebooks, too, gone. The police were overwhelmed. The town was fractured. Some parents fled with their surviving children, abandoning homes that had been theirs for generations. Others clung to faith, to ritual, to anything that might shield their families. But those who stayed near the school swore they saw figures at night. Children, pale and silent, standing in yards and fields in the woods, watching, waiting. June arrived. Only half the students remained. And yet Westbrook Elementary insisted on holding the last day of school. Parents begged them not to. Pleaded, but the board was stubborn. Denial runs deep when the truth is too monstrous to face. And so the buses came, and so the children entered room 2B1 last time. That afternoon, the school lost power again. Not just for 20 minutes this time, for hours. The entire town went black, as though something had drained the grid dry. When the lights returned, room 2B was empty. No children, no desks, no notebooks. Just a single message scratched into the blackboard, deep grooves gouged into the slate. The lesson is complete. The school closed permanently that summer. The building was left to rot, boarded up, chain link fencing circling its perimeter. Locals crossed the street to avoid it. Teenagers dared each other to break in at night. Some did, most didn't come back. And those who did return weren't quite the same. They'd stare into space, they'd draw the symbols, they'd hum the song. The substitutes returned years later, long after the town had moved on. After Westbrook Elementary had been condemned, Mr. Ashford appeared again. Not in the same town, not even in the same state, but always in a classroom, always with children, always with those plain black notebooks. No one knows what he is. A demon, a ghost, a parasite. But every so often whispers spread through small towns. Stories of kids who stop laughing, who start writing strange things, who vanish without trace. And always there's a teacher. A substitute, soft-spoken, pale-eyed, with a smile that never reaches his face. And that is the end of the first story. The substitute teacher. A lesson that no child should ever have learned. Every town has one. A story whispered in the hallways of its schools, traded like forbidden candy on the playground, carried like a stain from one generation of students to the next. In my town, it was room 6, not room 206, not 106, just 6, tucked at the end of a forgotten wing in Mill Creek Middle School, a squat red brick building that looked more like a fallout shelter than a place of learning. By the time I attended Mill Creek, room 6 had been locked for more than 30 years. The door was chained shut, the windows painted black, the hinges rusted from decades of neglect. Teachers didn't mention it. Custodians didn't go near it. And the principal, well, if you asked her about it, she'd give you the kind of look you give a child who asks where the family dog really went when he ran away. But kids have no respect for sealed doors. The stories were endless. Some said a student had died there, locked inside during a fire drill, his fingernails clawing at the door as the flames took him. Others swore a teacher went mad, barricading herself inside with 20 children, whispering lessons no one could hear until the janitor broke down the door and found the desks empty, the floor covered in notebooks filled with red ink. And then there was the oldest rumor, the one nobody told out loud but everyone knew, that room 6 had never belonged to the school at all, that it had always been there, older than the building, older than the town, a pocket of darkness stitched into the hallways like a tumor. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. The door was locked, the chains were thick, and room 6 was left to rot. I was 12 the first time I touched the doorknob. It was late, a Friday after detention. I was walking the back hall toward the exit when I passed it, room 6, the door hulking at the end of the corridor. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, flickering as though even electricity didn't want to linger there. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe the same thing that makes moths fly into flames. Maybe I wanted to prove I wasn't afraid. I reached out. The brass knob was ice cold, not cool, not drafty freezing. My skin stuck to it like metal in winter. And then I heard it. A shuffle, a scrape. The sound of a chair leg dragging across tile from inside. I yanked my hand back, heart thudding in my chest. The hallway was silent again. The knob gleamed in the buzzing light. That was the last time I walked that hall alone. Every horror story needs a catalyst, and ours came in the form of Jeremy Marsh. Jeremy was the new kid, always a dangerous role to play in middle school politics. He was taller than the rest of us, sharp-eyed, with a streak of stubborn rebellion that made teachers hate him and kids fear him. On his third day, someone told him about room 6. He laughed. What, you're all scared of a door? The bravado was classic, but it was what he said next that sealed our fate. Bet you $5 I can get inside. It was stupid. It was reckless, but it was middle school. The plan was simple. Jeremy would sneak into the East Wing after hours. We'd keep watch. He'd break into room 6 somehow and spend 5 minutes inside. If he came out alive, he'd be a legend. Friday night was chosen. We snuck back into the building after basketball practice, flashlights in our backpacks, adrenaline surging through our veins. The halls were different in the dark, longer, narrower. Every locker looked like a mouth. Every poster seemed to move when your eyes weren't focused on it. And then we reached the door. Room 6. The chains hung heavy iron links that should have been impossible to break. The windows were slabs of black, reflecting only our shaky beams of light. Jeremy stepped forward. He grinned at us, cocky, and then he pulled a pair of bolt cutters from his bag. The first snap of the chain echoed through the hall like a gunshot. We froze, listening, waiting for the squeak of sneakers, the shout of a janitor, the jingle of keys. But the building stayed silent. Jeremy cut the second link. The third. The chain slid to the floor in a heap of metal. He reached for the knob. "Wait," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What if the stories are true?" Jeremy's grin widened. "Then we finally find out." He turned the knob. The door opened. And for the first time in 30 years, room 6 breathed. The smell hit us first, rot, mold, damp earth, though there was no soil in the room. The air was thick, heavy, like walking into a cave. Jeremy's flashlight cut a weak beam through the dark. Desks stood in neat rows, though they were the old kind wooden, with inkwells carved into the corners. A blackboard covered one wall, streaked with faint chalk marks that looked too fresh for a room sealed decades ago. And then there were the notebooks. Dozens of them scattered across the desks. Small, black, identical. Jeremy picked one up, flipped it open. It wasn't blank. Every page was filled with writing. Neat, slanted handwriting that grew more frantic as it went, until the ink gouged through the paper. But it wasn't English, it wasn't any language we knew. Just symbols, repeated endlessly, looping, spiraling, burning themselves into our eyes. Jeremy whistled low. "Creepy, but it's just a bunch of scribbles." He tossed the notebook back onto the desk. That was when the door slammed shut behind us. The bang made us jump. One kid screamed. Jeremy ran to the door, yanking on the knob. It wouldn't budge. We were locked in. The air grew colder. Frost spread across the inside of the windows, tracing patterns that looked too much like the symbols in the notebooks. And then the blackboard began to write itself. No chalk in sight, no hand holding it. Just letters gouged deep into the slate as though carved by invisible claws. "Class begins now." When the blackboard finished writing those words, "Class begins now," the silence that followed was worse than any scream. We were a half circle of trembling kids, flashlights shaking in our hands, hearts thundering against ribs too small for such terror. And Jeremy Marsh, standing in front like a conductor of some doomed orchestra, wore a smile that was beginning to crack around the edges. "Okay," he said, voice thin. That's a trick. Some kind of projector." But no projector hummed. No wires ran across the floor. And the words burned fresh and wet, grooves cut deep into the slate. It was then I knew we weren't alone in room 6. The notebooks rustled. All of them. Every desk. Every row. Pages fluttered like trapped birds, though no wind stirred the room. Our flashlights skittered over the desks, catching glimpses of names scrawled across the top lines of the open pages. Names we knew. Our names, Jeremy Marsh, Eddie Thompson, Carla Ruiz, Maya Jenkins, all of us, written neatly at the top of separate notebooks as if they'd been waiting. My blood ran cold when I saw mine, Derek Hayes. The handwriting was perfect, like a teacher's roll call. The blackboard screeched again. The chalk lines appeared in quick, slashing movements. Present, one by one, our names burned into the slate. The room changed then. The air grew heavy, pressing against our lungs, making each breath feel stolen. Our flashlights flickered, dimmed, then sputtered out entirely. But the room did not go dark. It glowed. A sickly, yellow-white light oozed from the walls, pulsing like veins just beneath the surface. Desks stretched taller, wider, as though growing. The blackboard swelled, swallowing the wall, symbols crawling across it in an endless tide. And then came the voice. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was soft, everywhere at once, curling in our ears like smoke. "Children, open your books." Against our will, our hands moved. Fingers trembling, we reached for the notebooks. Pages fluttered open on their own, landing on fresh sheets. "Right." My hand clutched the pencil. I tried to stop it. God, I tried. But my fingers bent, bones aching as though strung up by puppet wire. The pencil scratched across the page, symbols, loops, spirals, the same language that filled every other book. Around me, every kid wrote, their eyes wide, pupils swallowing color. Jeremy was grinning still, but it was no longer bravado. It was hysteria. We were no longer children. We were students. Carla Ruiz was the first to fight. She dropped her pencil. She slammed the notebook shut. She screamed, "Stop!" so loud her voice cracked. The room didn't like that. The light dimmed, turned red, a raw pulse like a wound. The voice sharpened, slicing through our skulls. Disobedient. Carla convulsed. Her body arched backward, legs kicking against the floor. Her mouth opened, wider and wider, until it wasn't a mouth anymore, but a hole, a cavern swallowing her scream. And then she was gone? No blood? No body? Just her notebook, smoking faintly, the word absent carved deep into the blackboard. We didn't scream after that. We wrote numbers, that's what it wanted next, but not equations we knew. Not multiplication or division, these were wrong. Numbers that twisted when you looked at them. Equations that looped back into themselves, solving into nothing. Jeremy whispered, "This isn't math." This is quiet, the voice roared, and Jeremy's pencil stabbed his hand. He gasped, clutching his palm as blood seeped onto the paper. The notebook absorbed it greedily, the symbols glowing faintly as though fed. The numbers burned in my eyes. They crawled under my skin, burrowed deep. And even as I wrote them, even as my hand shook with every line, some part of me understood. We weren't solving problems, we were the problems. And the answer was always the same. Erase. We tried the door again. Eddie bolted, slammed his shoulder into it. The knob rattled, the chains clattered, but it wouldn't budge. "Let US out," he cried. The blackboard wrote back in slashing letters that cracked the slate. "Class is in session," and then came the sound. Footsteps from outside the room. Slow, deliberate, pacing up and down the hall. Every step a hammer against the silence. We froze, breath shallow. The steps stopped outside the door, and then, impossibly, the knob began to turn. The door opened. And in he walked, tall, thin, dressed in a tattered suit that might have been black once, but now was the gray of mold and ash. His face was long, too long, features sagging as though they'd been stretched. His eyes were pits of shadow, and his smile was nothing but teeth-long, yellow, jagged teeth. "Good afternoon, class," he said. His voice was the same one that had whispered in our ears. Gentle, patient, deadly, he strolled between the desks, tapping each notebook with a long, bony finger. Where he touched, the ink glowed. When he reached Carla's empty desk, he paused. "Absent," he murmured. His mouth stretched wider. "Unacceptable," he turned to us. "There will be no more absences." Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. But it wasn't the cheerful clang of school dismissal. It was deep, funeral deep. The toll of a church bell swung by invisible hands. The teacher's smile widened. "Recess!" He snapped his fingers. The floor cracked open. Beneath the desks yawned a pit of shadows, swirling, seething, alive. Clawing hands reached from the dark, pale and bony, grasping at our ankles. We screamed. We kicked. We scrambled onto the desktops as the hands clawed higher, pulling at shoelaces, scraping skin. Jeremy grabbed his flashlight, swung it at the teacher. The beam struck his face, and for a moment, just a moment, he flickered, not a man at all. A shape, long, thin, endless, with too many arms, with no face but a blackboard of eyes. The light sputtered, died, and the teacher stood whole again, grinning. "Class dismissed," he whispered. The floor was alive. Hands clawed up from the black pit, pulling at us, dragging at our shoes, our ankles, our very skin. Their fingers were thin, bone-white, skinless, every knuckle jutting like knives. We scrambled onto the desktops. Some of us made it. Eddie didn't. He slipped. Just one wrong move, his sneaker catching on the wood. His scream split the air as he was dragged down, hands closing around him like hungry mouths. His flashlight fell, bouncing off the desk, spinning in circles before it, too, was swallowed whole. The blackboard wrote one word across itself in jagged white. Absent, the teacher smiled. We were 6 left now. Jeremy, shaking but still forcing bravado. Maya, sobbing, hands bleeding from clawing her way onto the desk. 2 others, kids I barely knew, their names already fading in my memory. And me. The teacher strolled slowly, tapping desks with his bony fingers, humming some tuneless hymn that made the pit below writhe and moan. Jeremy leaned toward us, whispering frantically, We have to break the blackboard. That's where the power is. It made sense. The board was the mouth, the brain, the heart of the room. Everything came from it. But to reach it, we'd have to cross the pit, and the teacher stood between us and it. One of the kids, her name was Layla, I think, made the choice for us. She screamed, a sound torn from her throat like broken glass, and hurled her backpack at the teacher. He turned, smile twisting into a snarl, and in that instant she leapt from the desk. She ran straight for the blackboard. The pit surged. Hands snapped up, grasping, tearing at her jeans, her arms. She clawed free, stumbling forward. For one impossible second, I thought she might make it. She lifted her hand, and then the teacher raised his. Her body froze mid-step. Her scream cut off like a tape sliced in half. She hung there, trembling, eyes wide, before she collapsed in a heap. The blackboard scratched furiously, chalk shattering with the speed of the writing. Absent. The teacher turned back to us. His smile returned. Anyone else? Jeremy didn't hesitate. He grabbed his broken flashlight and hurled it with every ounce of strength he had. The metal casing slammed into the teacher's head. The figure staggered only slightly, but enough. His smile flickered. Now! Jeremy roared. We jumped. The pit screamed as we leapt from desk to desk, hands clawing, nails scraping our legs, but somehow we kept moving. We hit the floor and ran, sprinting toward the blackboard. The teacher roared, a sound that shook the walls. The light turned blood red. Desks crashed over, books flew, the air itself pressed against us like a storm. Jeremy reached the blackboard first. He raised his fist and slammed it against the slate. The board cracked. A spiderweb of fractures spread across the surface, glowing white-hot, symbols shivering and splintering. The voice screamed, not in words this time, but in pure, raw fury, a sound that made my nose bleed and my vision blur. The teacher staggered back, clutching his head, his shape flickering, unraveling. Arms split, multiplied, faces blinked in and out of existence across his form. Again, I screamed. We all struck. Fists, backpacks, shoes, whatever we had. The blackboard split wider, chunks falling, sparks spitting, and then it shattered. The sound was like glass breaking, like 1,000 windows blown apart at once. The room convulsed. The pit widened, swallowing desks, swallowing walls, swallowing everything. The ceiling cracked, beams splintering. The teacher screamed, reaching out, hands multiplying, stretching toward us. His mouth split wider and wider still until his head was nothing but a gaping void. You are my class, he roared. You will never graduate. Jeremy grabbed my arm, dragging me toward the door. It was open now, hanging off one hinge. Beyond it lay the hallway, impossibly bright compared to the bleeding dark of the room. We ran. Behind us the teacher lunged. His hands scraped the floor inches from our feet. His scream followed us, boiling our blood, rattling our bones, and then the room collapsed inward. Like a building imploding, room 6 folded in on itself, walls bending, ceiling crashing, floor sucking downward into the pit. The last thing we saw was the teacher's mouth swallowing itself, vanishing into nothing, and then silence. We collapsed in the hallway. The door to room 6 was gone, just smooth brick wall where it had been, no knob, no chains. No sign it had ever existed. There were 4 of us left, Jeremy, Maya, a boy whose name I can't remember. And me. We never spoke of it again. The teachers never asked. The janitors never noticed. The school carried on like nothing had happened, like room 6 had never been there. But sometimes when the halls were quiet, I'd hear it, the faint scratch of chalk, the echo of a bell tolling deep underground, and the whisper, soft and patient, curling in my ear,